All right, greetings, friends, and this is going to be lecture 4 of week 7. This is your final lecture, and I want to just walk us through something briefly here that I developed for my dissertation, and it was done in collaboration with some of the material that Brian Zare uses through Intentional Impact. He's a phenomenal consultant. If you've got the financial capacity as a church to look for a consultant, there's 3 that I would really highly recommend, and that would be Will Mancini, Sean Lovejoy, and then also Brian Zare. Brian Zare is a good friend of mine here in the Chicagoland area, and I'm just really impressed with the material he puts out. I was at a conference that he led, this has been several years ago, and he got my wheels spinning about the nature of how we develop vision and culture within the life of an organization. His format looks a little bit different than mine, but I was able to build upon some of the concepts that he utilizes in that conference that I attended. And what I want to talk to us a little bit is how do we get to this place where our organization is able to fulfill the dream that God has for it. And so one of the things that we have to talk about is we have to talk about the development of vision, which we've been talking about, clarifying that vision. But we can't just jump from vision to strategy, because I think what happens when we jump from vision to strategy, from what I see to how am I going to get things done, we miss one of the most glaring pieces of the stability and the glue that holds together the possibilities of the vision becoming an actualized reality, right? And I think that's the nature of culture. Peter Drucker often has said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. That's not to say that strategy, how we get there, what we have to do, is unimportant. What it means is that strategies, even when they shift and move, if the culture is stable, solid, and healthy, it sustains us in the midst of this. So strategy is about creating the plan. Culture is about creating the conditions whereby that plan can become a reality. And if the conditions are not present, then we have to realize that if the conditions aren't present, then we have to realize that the strategy probably isn't going to work itself out. And one of the things there's often also a question: what comes first? Is it your vision or your culture? And I think that's like asking which is first, the chicken or the egg. But I do believe that there is an immediate feedback loop between the DNA or the culture of an organization and the vision itself, because if there's misalignment, the vision will not become a reality. But as you begin to dream about and think about what this culture, this DNA of the organization needs to be to fulfill the vision of the organization, then we have to move and we have to begin to clarify and articulate clearly what the values are, the explicit articulation of the expectations of our culture. If vision states, this is what I see, DNA states, this is who we will be, value states, these are the core operational elements and assumptions necessary to ensure that what I see and who we long to be become a reality. And so you have to be able to name very clearly, what are the values of our organization? Do our people understand that? Do they embody that? Do they embrace it? Can they name those things? When I mentioned in my previous lecture that I probably messed it up, I changed the values. We developed a new set of values that we called respond, realign, restore, reproduce, and I don't think those had really a chance to take root. I displaced one set of values for a new set of values. Not that those old values weren't in the new values, but they weren't as clearly articulated, and I think I probably disrupted some things and wasn't there long enough for those to solidify in the way that they needed to prior to my departure. And that's what I really wanted to share with you in terms of the learning curve that I had from my previous organization. And I believe that somewhere between 4 and 7 values is a sweet spot. There's a reason why most phone numbers are 7 digits, because our minds can remember that. So we want to think in terms of what are the 4 to 7 values necessary for us to live into this culture, to fulfill the vision. But here's another piece, and this is, I think, extremely important. Values cannot just be something that is maintained up here. People don't simply think their ways into new being, right? They practice themselves into new being. And so this is where I think not only do you have to develop a core value, but then you have to establish a behavioral pattern or a practice that implements that value in real and tangible ways, and it has a way of validating or authorizing that value within the lived practices of the organization itself. So for instance, we value compassion. Well, one of the practices is We have to help our congregations be in relationship and be in proximity of serving and standing with those who are suffering. Then we have to create a kind of feedback loop where people can process how they experienced what they endured in that moment. It's a pattern of behavior that facilitates the value and gives flesh to it. And so we need to think about, in what ways are my values connected to a set of behaviors in our organization, so that those behaviors can reinforce the values that shape the culture, that lead us towards the fulfillment of our vision. A church that has values. The next element of this is what we call narratives. If the culture of the organization is the ethos, then the stories provide the pathos of the organization, the connectedness, the sense of feeling and emotive response to who we say we're going to be. It was interesting when I arrived at Bridgeway. It was fascinating, actually. For most of the people that I encountered early on in those days, they weren't using the language of the values that had been articulated, the 8 values that they were using. They were telling stories. And in the telling of the stories, those stories themselves reinforced the values, even if the words of the values weren't in the stories themselves. It was the expression of the stories that seemed to say, this is who we are. And I think those stories become so important. It's why we talked about curating stories a few weeks ago. I think they're so vital and so integral into this process. There's a missional theologian by the name of Alan Roxburgh, and he says these: a legitimating narrative is an overarching story that provides a group, a small unit, or a whole of a society with a way to express its underlying values, beliefs, and commitments about who they are and how life is to be lived. It's a story that tells a group who they are, what is acceptable, and what is the proper way to live. So curating those stories that reinforce the behaviors that reinforce the values that often emerge from behaviors that speak to our culture, so we can fulfill our vision. And I think what happens then is a community begins to emerge. The identity of a congregation or organization is a coalescence of all of these pieces. And I just want to read to you this as I wrote it in my dissertation. The identity of a congregation is formed through the intentional casting of a vision with its subsequent culture, the embrace of values shared across the community, enacted through intentional behaviors and shared practices, and giving voice through legitimating narratives. A congregation's being in the world is the fruit of these elements working together to shape the relational posture towards God, God's mission, themselves, and the community that it finds itself in. So when you begin to think in terms about how do we get to where we need to go, we need to think about in terms of vision. What do we see? The DNA. Who are we called to be? Like, how are we going to exist in this world? The values. What are those organizational assumptions that need to be embedded in the very DNA of who we are and articulated clearly? What are the behaviors that reinforce those values? What are the legitimate narratives that authorize the very essence of our vision, mission, and strategies within the context of our culture? And then in what ways does our community reflect all of that? And so it begins to give you a model by which you can begin to process through where you go from here. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, and I'm going to only do so briefly, is that we're going to be working towards an organizational execution and implementation plan. And I'm going to be posting a lecture next Monday, which is going to give you some outlines on that as well. But I am deeply indebted to the work of Will Mancini in his book, Church Unique, and then also God's Dreams. And what he does is he gives us a couple tools. The first off being the vision frame, where he says, let's clarify what sort of frames out who we are as a congregation. So you can think of that in light of some of the elements that I gave you in my model. But then he introduces us to something that was extremely helpful to us: the vision, the horizon storyline. And in that horizon storyline, he breaks it up. He gives us, he says, like, where do you want to be in 5 years? And then where do you want to be in 3 years? And what are the steps you're going to have to be taking in 3 years in order to get to where you are in 5 years? What does your 1 year mid-range vision look like? I mean, how do you get there, right? And then on the foreground, like the very first part of the picture, what does quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4 look like in this next year? What are the key strategic and implementative strategies and actions you need to take in order to fulfill? For some of us, our year 1 will be a conducive vision that is shared across and broadly across our congregation so that we can fulfill the mission that God has for us. In Q1, you may have to call together that critical massive group that we talk about in Cotter's Steps of Change. You might have to call together that group of people who can begin to help you. So you got to name those things, and we'll break that down a little bit more clearly next week when we pull those pieces together. But I want to just introduce you those. If you want to do a little more research, you can look those up. So that's the end of this week's lectures, and then we'll pick some more up next week.